Welcome everyone to Scheller Lunchtime Live, a live stream series hosted by the Georgia Tech Scheller College of Business. My name is Lindsay Kane, and I'm the Associate Director of Client Relationships for non-degree executive education programs. On select Fridays at 12 p.m. Eastern, you'll have a chance to hear from Scheller faculty, student, and alumni speakers as they discuss relevant topics for the tech-driven digital age. At Scheller, we're proud to offer undergraduate, MBA, and PhD programs, along with open enrollment and custom executive education programs. It's my pleasure to introduce Manpreet Hora, Associate Professor of Operations Management, whose research empirically addresses specific challenges in three areas: managing operational risk through capturing knowledge from low-frequency, high-impact operational failures, building learning and innovation capabilities in supply chain management, and codifying knowledge in processes and routines. Professor Hora has published in journals such as Management Science, Journal of Operations Management, and Production and Operations Management. His work has been covered by NPR, CNN Money, and Bloomberg Business Week. Today, Professor Hora will discuss the growing trend of servitization, in which companies like Netflix and Spotify sell products through delivering services. He will talk about the opportunities and risks of servitization and the basic conditions that need to be in place to enhance the value proposition and avoid failure. Turning it over to you, Manpreet.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. Thank you for making this happen. Thank you to all the attendees for taking our time over their lunchtime, dinner time, wherever in the world they are, to attend this presentation. The intent today is to talk about servitization. And before I do that, I also want to thank Lindsay and the team and Paul and everybody to make this lunchtime series happen. So Paul, if you could please pull up the slides. Thank you. Thank you, Paul. You see the word servitization that you see on your screen. And if you look on a Webster's dictionary, this word probably doesn't exist. It's a made-up word. It's been evolving over time. It's capturing a phenomena more than anything else right now. Predominantly, it's been looking at companies that were actually quote-unquote manufacturing products and are now moving from just not adding value-added services, but are moving towards services per se, and the product is moving some sort in the background here. So that word of servitization, where a lot of companies are adding on, and Lindsay just mentioned Spotify and Netflix, those are the sort of the cooler, nicer examples. But this is not something new. It's been happening since 1970s, 60s as well, where if you go back to Xerox, you go back to IBM, you go back to digital, there were companies that would order add-on services. So what's changed? And is it really giving us a competitive advantage, or it could actually be a burn on our expense account? So let's sort of unravel that in the next few minutes we have together. So welcome again for joining in this topic of servitization. So the way I want to sort of break this up is bring out four main aspects to capture this phenomena. One is, what are the key observations? Let's pick up some traditional product-based companies and see where does servitization come from there, and are there any key low-hanging observations we can anecdotally make from looking at these examples. Then let's try and give a definition to servitization and say, what's the onset and the evolution that's happening? Well, what are the key enablers that will ensure that we can excel in servitization? What are the basic conditions that we need to qualify for to make it eligible to transition from either being a product-based company or starting sort of on a green field to make sure there are enabling conditions and basic conditions to ensure servitization happens? Sort of, we fail less and success more. And finally, what are the challenges? What do we need to know more? What is changing in the value system, in the value chain? What's happening with sustainability along those elements? Where are our revenue models? And then I'll leave it up for Q&A. So let's pick up the first example of a company called Caterpillar, a really heavy machinery company. And the first thing that comes to our mind if you think of Caterpillar is as you're driving down your expressways and highways is these heavy machinery and being involved with construction. And this company is relatively very asset intensive, but the blurb you see on your screen from their 2018 annual report tells you they are finding a lot of ways to connect with their customer slash client through telematics, through machine learning, and give them more value over and above what the product would have given itself. And this is not only happening in Caterpillar. You can look at John Deere, you can look at companies like New Holland, where this is prevalent now. In 2018, Caterpillar's revenue was about $54 billion. And of that, services through that they were providing over and above the products they were selling, of those $54 billion was about $18 billion. So just pause and think about this. Your 1/3 of your revenue is coming from services, 33%. In 2016, their revenue was half of that $18 billion from coming from services. So a paramount example of Caterpillar in a heavy industry, relatively more upstream. Let's pick up another example. Philips. Philips is a company which is a conglomerate known for several products and services. Let's pick up lighting. And in the LED market, they have captured in the last 10 years, starting from 2010, to offer lighting as a service, where they are telling their business-to-business clients to pay more attention on operating expense rather than capital expense in lighting. And so much so that now it's become a company of its own. It's sort of spun off in 2018, and it's called Signify. Now, there are challenges as they are building this lighting as a service model, and we'll talk about what we conjecture those can be. But it's a phenomena to keep in mind, keeping Caterpillar in mind, keeping Philips Lighting in mind. Now, both these examples are looking at the business-to-business phase. And if you think from an evolutionary standpoint, servitization has happened predominantly in business-to-businesses. Now, let's pick up another example of Nike. Nike in 2018 and 2019 is a company which has tried to make their products more experiential, like Apple. They try and connect a lot with their customers. They try and understand their behaviors, their habits, and their brand affinity with Nike. And one of those headlines you're seeing there, amongst others, is they are offering a subscription service, betting convenience equals sale. This is in a business to consumer market. They're using a lot of analytics to say, can we create an example where we are in the business to consumer market to offer products, but more, let's so, in an ownership basis, but more on a usership basis. What product companies in a business to business environment were doing, well, what's happening with those in the business to consumer environment? And if you, as you're looking at this Nike example, you can think of Stitch Fix, you can think of Rent a Runway, and a lot of those examples that are in our mind for product-based companies. So looking at these three examples, what are our key observations we make before we jump to the boring definition and bring down what research is looking at? So the first key observation that we bring out here is the product-based companies are moving now towards a product as a service, where they're using technology, what you see on your left, is as an element for engaging the customer, for making the customer sticky, for hopefully reducing volatility in their earnings and revenue. And that aspect is giving them to move not only from selling products, but from making relationships as product as a service. And some of you who are working in technology, this term is nothing new. We are using it for software as a service, platform as a service, infrastructure as a service, and plenty of these examples and industries are coming out, as we are talking about this element of transitioning from just being a product company per se to moving as product as a service. So that's a straightforward learning and observation coming from these three anecdotal examples. What's the observation number 2 that comes out from these examples? A lot of these companies are moving from being dominant in manufacturing, that was on the left side, and are slowly positioning themselves to being dominance of service. And if you think of and pause and think of this element of being on a continuum, it's really hard for us to say, are you a product company or a service company? While it's become second nature for us to identify companies with what they make, calling them in certain quote unquote industries, being product based industries, and then some service based industries. So think of the Disneys of the world, the Ritz-Carlton of the world. We very easily gravitate for calling them service companies. And then we look at the Caterpillars of the world, we look at the automotive companies, we put them in manufacturing. Well, that line is blurring and blurring relatively fast in terms of our services as an add-on or our goods as an add-on. And so that becomes a really important point to keep in mind, that these observations are telling us from looking at the example of Nike, looking at the example of Caterpillar, and looking at the example that we're bringing out in terms of what is Philips doing. And all these 3 examples are telling us that line is not as clear-cut as we want. As we understand, we need to have some industry classification, but business models are changing. Key observation 3, and this is coming from my background in supply chain. And if you look at this, is basically telling us, from upstream when the product is sourced to downstream when the product is delivered to the customer, we make products, we plan, we deliver, and we take returns. That landscape, the ecosystem is changing when we are offering products as services or as we are embarking on servitization. So while this circular picture you see on your screen is telling us that there is the supply chain aspect, it needs to be reconfigured. Now, what is it going to be? That may depend on what industry we are in. And that's the third main call observation that comes out from these anecdotal examples. So now just let's take a pause. We've talked about the examples. We've talked about the observations from these examples. Now, what are the elements of servitization? First element, we are predominantly selling the functionality. The product is there. The product could be a digital product or a physical product. That's there. But the intent is to sell functionality of the product rather than the product per se. That's the first big element. Second, in a lot of products which are heavily capital intensive, the ownership lies with the manufacturer, or in this case, as you move to the servitization model, with the service provider. That's where the product ownership lies. Third, the service provider provides maintenance, repairs, replenishments, and any type of replacement that's required is taken care of by the service provider and the manufacturer. So 3 things are important: functionality, ownership, and predominantly ownership, not for some components and parts. So if you're, a company like Goodyear or Dunlop, which is selling tires to automotive companies, certainly the tires don't lie with you. They have to be given to the car company. But anything that's required to ensure the serviceability is there, the onus lies on the Goodyears and the Dunlops of the world. So given these 3 aspects you see on the top, the key elements of servitization that this brings out is you are now trying to sell customer value rather than the product itself. And product is more so a platform, but that's not the key value proposition. The value proposition is coming from the services that you're offering. And the customers, the business model that the company builds up through customers is either through subscription fee rather than the product per se. It's also either through the usage you do. And you can think of your own Netflix, Shopify, pay-per-view, all those examples that come to mind in the elements of servitization that's happening. Now, as we think of the servitization, it's also good to take a pause and say, well, some of you are scratching your head and saying, it's not much new. We've done this before. And to capture that, Professor Theodore Levitt put it in really nice terms. He says, when he was differentiating between products and services, and the term he used is, people don't buy a quarter-inch drill. They want a quarter-inch hole. So the background story here is, you are looking for products, but you are deriving utility from those products. And as you're deriving utility from those products, the question is, where is that value added coming? The value added is coming in that hole that you want to put maybe a picture on the wall. And as a result, you need the drill. So if I'm a drill making company, I need to understand what my product is giving as a value proposition to the client/end consumer. So with that aspect in mind, what's changed with the Spotify's, the Netflix, software as a service, the Nike example, the Caterpillar example, the Philips example? What's changed, folks, is we have had key enablers that are propelling servitization at a fast pace in the last decade and in the coming decade that we hadn't seen before. And what are those key enablers? Those key enablers, if you think of as a service economy that's happening around us, are fourfold, going counterclockwise in terms of, we have emerging technologies that have really helped propel this. Think of the digitization that's happening. Think of automation. Think of artificial intelligence, cognitive computing. These are all topics on their own, which need further exploration, which have propelled this element of as a service economy. Second, besides that happening, the world we live in has changed. How has the world we live in has changed? Consumerization has changed. Think of the pandemic that's happening around us. How have we are using our products as services? Also think about the global labor market. Several of you may be from around the world. And as that globalization of labor market has changed, that's propelled as a service economy where we can decouple processes to bring a good end service delivery. So those two enablers are coming more from the tools and technologies perspective. If you move further counterclockwise to enabling talent and operating models and platform, that's where the governance comes into play. What is enabling talent? Enabling talent that's happened to make sure that this happens is, we are looking at aspects from the labor market and from the adoption market, from service governance perspective, that is helping us go through this. So there's an ecosystem that's being created with this enabling talent. And finally, the operating models and platforms. Some of us use in second nature terms like shared services, platform as a service, infrastructure as a service. And those operating models and platforms have enabled the services economy to go on. So while the word servitization and from Professor Levitt is existing, it's more prominent and profound now than it was before. And again, there is much more to this slide, which I borrowed and adapted from HFS research, but it tells us that these are key elements for us to enable servitization to happen. But please, before we get here, let's get to an aspect of service operations to see in service operations, what are the basic conditions we need even before we get to the enablers. We want to make it a comparative advantage rather than a necessary evil. And for that, let's pick up on some basic 101 conditions before we reach this nice slide on enablers. What are the basic aspects we want as a service company as we transition from a product-based company to a service-based company? To make it more cliche, the three P's we want to keep in mind here are purpose, process, and people. And the first aspect is, once we move from transitioning from a product-based company to a as a service model, where would the customer see value? Is the customer's value coming from reliability? Is it coming from responsiveness? Is it coming from agility? Is it a combination of all those? And that intent of value becomes really important. Because please keep in mind, product is an add-on in servitization. Service is your core competency now. So if you are embarking on that transition, you want to understand your customer value in this redefined, reconfigured business model. At the same time, you want to help them reduce their own operational risk as well. Second is, well, what will change in your own processes? As you're going through an end-to-end supply system, from a value perspective, what changes in your own company? And finally, well, are your own people ready for this change? Think of when we talk in large manufacturing companies, people who work in manufacturing are predominantly industrial engineers. People who work in marketing and services are predominantly coming from a sales side. Now you're trying to marry both of them together. You are asking your engineers to be a customer service savvy sales force or an employee. You're telling them to be boundary spanners. You're telling them to be employees who understand the marketing or services side and also understand the product side. It's not trivial for those to happen. I'll speak for a couple more minutes and then look at the Q&A. I know quite a few questions are coming up, Lindsay. So I want to sort of wrap it up in 2 minutes. So these are the basic conditions we want to sort of pick up on. Now, besides key enablers. But the story is not that clear-cut. I gave some good examples in the beginning, but let's look at what's happened during the pandemic right now. In last year, if there are any examples, and we're getting mixed outcomes, at least from the perspective of anecdotes. The example I gave you for the Nike subscription/adventure club, they opened in 2019. Well, they closed it in 2020. Now, it means two aspects. Well, what's going to happen with experimentation? Well, we have to keep trying going forward what happens, and also understand the basic conditions and the key enablers. Will they propel and gravitate towards having customer adoption? Second, look at the example of a positive example during the pandemic of these companies which are based in cloud services, the big wigs of Amazon, Microsoft, and Google. And if you look at their results from last year, they've really sort of propelled further because in pandemic, a lot of us were using their cloud-based services. Examples like Rent the Runway have been now thinking during the pandemic of how can they reconfigure or revisit their business model. So with this, I want to leave some food for thought of the questions we've not answered. And again, this is a cluttered slide, and I will want to sort of wrap it in a minute or so, is we need to reconfigure our supply chains and value systems. And for that, my MBA students and I, we work on assignments when I teach service operations to understand and see, as consultants, as academics, well, how do we categorize? What happens when there is a digitized product? What happens when there is a physical product? What happens in configurations which are business to business, which are business to consumers? And those become an important aspect for understanding what ecosystems are going to come in place. Well, what challenges are there for firms to understand within themselves? Well, how much are they going to spend in capital expenditure versus operating expenditure? What level of experimentation they want to do with servitization? What elements within the firm they want to bring for excellent service delivery? What happens to product design? Because keep in mind, the product is not coming back to you. What is the circular economy impact? And one of the examples with Philip is when they offered lighting as a service, one of their salient points was, well, they're taking care of the circular economy. How do we make this model more scalable as we go through it? And then is the ever-ending perennial question on customer acquisition and customer retention. With that, I know I've spoken a lot. I'll take a pause and I will leave it to Q&A. And I know I probably went really fast. to cover my slides, but thank you so much for being a great audience, and I'll pass it on to Lindsay for questions.
Thank you, Manpreet. You have a ton of questions here, so we'll try to get through as many as possible. Hopefully, you'll be able to go into the comments on the page later and answer a few of them that we don't get to. But I think a really great question to start with, what are some companies that are doing, servitization really well, and what are some industries that are not really suited for servitization?
All right, so I think that's a great, I would say, $1 billion question, as companies are spending that money. And to the person who asked this question, a lot of companies that have actually done well is in the business to business space, where it was a one to few relationship rather than a one to many relationship in the physical product space. And they did it relatively well because for them, the transition has happened over decades. Second is the companies who've done well in the business to consumer space are the companies which had more media aspect, digital aspect. They have done relatively well in capturing the market. The third companies which I think are still experimenting and haven't done well, I'll give you a prime example, is Procter & Gamble tried with its Tide pods, the pods you put in your washing machine. They tried to, about 3 years ago, they experimented with servitization, and they said, well, let's buy some dry cleaners and let's be vertically integrated in the supply chain. And for that reason, we'll be using Tide pods there. Unfortunately, it didn't go out as well as they envisioned. And partly, if I have to make a conjecture to answer the question why it didn't wear very, very well, is partly the value proposition, what the customer was looking for, wasn't coming through dry cleaning. It's in the end, going back to Theodore Levitt's example, it's probably coming with clean clothes. And there may be other routes for Procter & Gamble to temporally or spatially configure themselves in this value chain to capture the customer.
Thank you. So I think we have time for one more question, and I'm really sorry to everyone we didn't get to. In your view, what departments and functions within a company are most important to driving this transformation?
I think that's a great question, and we didn't jump to this, and that comes back to the question of service design. What do we internally do in our companies, where some of us, in the product-based companies, we are working in functional silos, and now we want to integrate, let alone integrate the value chain outside the company. How do we integrate within the company? I think a starting point would be to have a department which brings people from engineering, from product-based, forecasting, marketing, who understand their sales side well, to bring it together, to understand that none of us, we have to look downstream to our customers, and we have to be boundary spanners. And that multitasking is a qualifier right now. It may not be a winner to sustain the servitization, but it's a qualifier. It's sort of an eligibility criteria that companies have to go through, because please remember, for a lot of well-established companies, you're not starting on a green field. You are a very well-established company, so you have to revisit your models. And through digitization, you have to understand what transformation may need to happen. So, the ones I can think of is, how will we have the business? How will we fund this? Where are the customers coming from? Understanding that market. And then how will we make that underlying product for which we are servitizing as well?
Well, thank you so much, Manpreet, and thank you everyone to joining and the great comments we had today. Our next Scheller Lunchtime Live session is Friday, February 12th at 12 p.m. Eastern. The topic is virtual reality and its place in the future of learning, featuring Scheller alumnus and managing partner of Foundry 45, Dave Beck. Dave will discuss how VR technology is being used to train, reskill, and upskill the current workforce. You can register for this event and learn more about future Scheller Lunchtime Live sessions by following the Georgia Tech Scheller College of Business on LinkedIn. A recording of the session and future sessions will be available on our page as well. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you.